My session flow looks like the following. I'll start with the foundation, talking about different Azure CLI or command line interface options which are available today. Followed by zooming in on AZD, Azure Developer CLI, and why I think it's the best command line tool to use. From there, I'll switch to AZD in action, which means primarily doing demos, and then last closing with some additional information if you want to use it even more based on what I'm showing you as part of my demos. So my name is Peter de Tender, originally from Belgium, but moved to the Redmond area a bit more than 3 years ago. My job within Microsoft is a Microsoft technical trainer, which means I'm providing training on Azure and in meantime AI and Copilot as well for our global customers, and it's all virtual. And I started that role about 6 years ago, and about 3 years ago managed to move to Redmond to continue the same role. You got my contact details here on the slide, so I would say feel free to reach out whenever you want, asking questions about the topic or anything else Azure AI or Copilot related. So with that, let's have a look at the different Azure CLI options. The first one coming to mind is Azure CLI using Bash, which is close to the Linux Bash shell command line approach. Now, some highlights from here is it's cross-platform, so no operating system dependency to use. Pretty straightforward commands to manage your Azure resources, so something like AZ VM list to pull up a list of virtual machines, AZ web app create, AZ resource group create, and so on. All Azure CLI commands can be integrated in a larger automation script using shell scripting in this case, or why not even as part of CI/CD pipelines in Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, or any other DevOps tool. And it also allows for custom extensions. Now last, I think you would primarily use Azure CLI to deploy Azure infrastructure, although it also allows for application deployment depending a bit on the scenario, like web apps, functions, and even containers would actually be possible. Second one is Azure CLI, but now using PowerShell. So basically the alternative, and I think this is a bit more historical, when Windows admins were using PowerShell to manage Windows servers and Microsoft Server solutions like SQL, Exchange, and maybe a few other ones. Now in the meantime, PowerShell is also cross-platform, which makes it a viable option for any cloud admin, a developer, or even a DevOps engineer to use it. It does basically the same as the Azure CLI from before, but now using PowerShell as the prime syntax. So instead of AZ VM list, you would do something like get-AZ VM or new-AZ web app, and so on and so on. And as you can expect, the same as Bash, it's typically used for, again, infrastructure deployments, but they also allow for some application deployment as well. Next option here is using the same from the two previous slides, but instead of installing the tool PowerShell or Azure CLI on your local machine, you would now use it straight from the Azure portal. It spins up a little container in the backend and connecting to Azure storage if you want for keeping some data as well as command history in a persistent storage. And then obviously last is Azure Developer CLI or AZD. Now the big difference with AZD up till now is that it allows for end-to-end workflow deployments, not just deploying infrastructure, but also the application layer. Now I tend to say that it actually started from the need for developers to have something available to quickly spin up Azure infrastructure, which they need for their applications. Now the infra aspect of it supports Bicep and Terraform, which is already beneficial. And then obviously, since it's command line based, it also allows for integration with CI/CD pipelines and also extensively supporting environment management. Cool. So that 4 options of Azure CLI, where now I will move to the next part and helping understanding why AZD is the best option, if you ask me. Now, the official definition from the AZD product group is, first of all, it's open source. Next to that, it accelerates the provisioning and deployment of your application resources. So the focus is really starting from the app and a bit less on the Azure resources. It provides developer-friendly comment, natively integrating with all common development interfaces like Visual Studio VS Code, Eclipse, IntelliJ, and obviously also CI/CD pipelines. Now, I would say don't feel scared or be tempted because it has the word developer in the name, and you go like, well, that's fine, Peter, but I'm not a developer. But the good thing is I'm not a developer either, and I love AZD. So I hope out of my demos in the next part, I can actually convince you to at least have a look at it. Now, the part I like most about AZD is, for example, like this one, that it is really scenario oriented. So it's not just like deploy me the web app infrastructure, set up a virtual network, deploy a virtual machine, or why not run this template based on, again, Bicep or Terraform. It's really providing that infrastructure layer as well as the application layer. And obviously, since it relies on infra as code using Bicep or Terraform that I already mentioned, you could also use it to just deploy any of these. Now, in this first example, we're primarily needing infrastructure components like a virtual machine, but no specific application installed in it, an Azure VPN gateway, for example, and some virtual network setup. So I think for this kind of scenario, most probably up till now, you probably relied on Azure CLI or deploying it through a template. Now, what if our workload becomes a little bit more complex, meaning we need more application-oriented building blocks, like in this sample workload. So there's not a lot of actual compute infrastructure needed because it's all serverless components. We're going to deploy a storage account, we're going to deploy some Azure functions, we're going to deploy some Azure AI service, an Azure Cosmos database, application insights, Key Vault, and again, it's not about the resources, right? It's really about this is a bit more than just deploying virtual machines and a VNet. So deploying this could start again from Azure CLI, preferably using, I guess, infrastructure as code to really build that infrastructure. But then on top of that, you would still need to deploy the applications, like maybe manual, again, maybe CLI in case of functions would still be okay. But then what if we want to deploy across different environments? Like starting, for example, in a dev environment in East US, moving to staging in East US again, why not? And eventually having a redundant production environment in East US 2 and West US. Now I know it's all doable using variables, parameters, scripting logic, but are developers really that good in CLI? Do they actually run infrastructure as code? That's like the question I would ask myself. And obviously you can guess, ta-da, AZD to the rescue. And I'm joking about it for now, but again, I hope that my upcoming demos will actually help you understanding. And by the way, I'll show you how this exact scenario with functions and everything around it can actually be deployed using AZD as well. Now, in short, what you would do is creating the templates, running AZD init, running an AZD environment new, and then last AZD up, 3 basic commands, and it basically spins up the whole environment. And that's, I would say, mainly it. So what we're doing now is not preferably using Azure CLI anymore, at least not for these cases, right? I'm not breaking down CLI. Obviously, we still need our templates, but then also shifting away from the manual application layer deployment and moving everything into one single deployment scenario. And that's really what I would say my next topic here, AZD in action, is about. Now, the starting point is obviously installing AZD. So for any operating system, and even a Docker container extension is available. So I don't have a demo on this. I assume it's so pretty obvious. You could use winget on the Windows platform, maybe Chocolate, or just downloading the installer and running the setup. Same for Linux and macOS, by the way. So once we have our tool installed, the next step is basically going through 4 steps for any kind of scenario. Whether you want to deploy a simple one, like just infrastructure, a simple one with a web app and an application, or obviously the more complex one, like I showed you, and I got a few more examples on that. So you would start with AZD init, from there AZD environment new, AZD up to spin it up, and AZD down to actually delete the resources. Before jumping into a sequence of demos, I'm going to switch back and forth a little bit for each and every of the commands. So the starting point is AZD init. That's the command you're going to use to initialize a new application workload scenario. And you can start from a new directory, that's what I would recommend, and literally starting from scratch, like there's nothing in there. And you could do AZD init and deciding if you want to use a template. And I'll talk about templates a little bit more, because in this case we're talking about AZD templates, not just Bicep or Terraform. Or you could start from a minimal project. It's coming from the AZD product team, who actually provided like a full set of artifacts allowing you to get started. So I personally like that minimal project, as it gives you all the basics you need to get going. It creates the full AZD compatible scaffolding, which means an infra folder for Bicep or Terraform, a source folder for the application source files, a .azure folder for storing parameters about your environments, and then last an azure.yaml file, which provides you some scenario settings that I'll show you as part of the demo. Talking about demos, right? Let's jump in and get started with our first part in our flow, running some AZD init examples. So let's start with creating a new folder. So we could do something like make directory AZD live demo. And then from here, as you heard in the presentation, it's nothing more than AZD init. But before running AZD init, let me show you a few of the other options we have. A little bit too big, there we go. So you can do authenticate to Azure. If you didn't do this step, then it's going to ask you the first time you run an AZD provision or AZD up. Configuration to define different Azure subscriptions, hard coding your preferred locations, for example. Then something I don't really talk about in this presentation, but just know that it's there, is AZD hooks, allowing you to run scripts, PowerShell or Bash scripts, before running a deployment or after running a deployment. Then init, I'll show you in a second, right? And then some restore, finding a template. And then from there you could also run the deploy, and I'll talk about some of those options as part of the presentation as well. And then it also comes with an application deployment dashboard, which basically shows you a stripped down application insights dashboard, where you can pull up some base information after your application got deployed, assuming that there is an application, obviously. So right now it's an empty directory, so we're going to do AZD init, and from here we got a couple of questions. Scenario 1, use code in the current directory. I don't have an app, so that's not really useful. Template, I'll show you later. So let's move on and show you create minimal project. So what it's going to do here is creating the Azure YAML file with some settings, running a git clone from the AZD product team backend into my local machine, and it's asking for an environment name. So I'm going to call this the PDT AZD live demo. And that's pretty much it. So from here we can have a look at what actually got created. So I'm using Visual Studio Code, but you could do this obviously in any kind of development environment. So we have our .azure, where now we have our environment. And from here, for now at least, it's only having one parameter or environment variable called Azure env name with the name of the environment I defined like a second ago. Inside the config, there's nothing for now. And from here, it's currently using version 1 of my environment, and this is the default. When I run my deployment later on, it's going to use this one as the default. Inside the infra, so that's the place where you would store your infrastructure as code files. In this case, I didn't specify what kind of template, so it picked Bicep. And from here, it's everything you might already know from Bicep. So you're going to create scope. So in this case, we're scoping the subscription. Why is that? Because down here, we're creating a resource group. And you can only link a resource group to a subscription. From here, you can make this a lot more Bicep-y, I would say, which means that you can create one massive Bicep file or splitting up across different resources Bicep. And I'll show you an example of that in another part of my demos. And then inside the Azure YAML, for now it's storing the name. In the docs, there's a few other pointers, like a metadata options you have to send some telemetry information to the AZD product team, for example, to allow them to monitor your templates, to monitor what kind of deployments you're running, if the deployments are successful. So not really capturing anything specific. It's more like sending some pulse, like, hey, I'm using AZD, and by the way, this is the scenario I'm running. Literally all it takes, AZD init and starting from minimal deployment. Back to the presentation. Good. So the next step here is we have our AZD init done. We have a new folder. It's creating that scaffolding artifact. And now we want to define environments. So as you could see from the previous slides, I think as a developer, but not excluding anyone else, you're probably going to use different environments. Now, one of the things it does, and it's obviously templating, it's using your environment name for the resource group naming convention as well. So you can define multiple environments using the same templates in the backend. And like I had in the slide, publishing one environment would point to Azure EastUS, development, staging, EastUS, and then production across different environments. So it's really that easy. You type in AZD environment new, and then you also got AZD environment list, you got AZD environment select, and you could also push some parameters, variables inside your environment configuration as well. Next to that, there's also a bunch of environment variables already available out of the box, specifically related to Azure, like a subscription variable, the principal ID, which I personally like. If you want to add role-based access into your templates, you could now literally point to that principal ID environment variable. And I don't have all of them listed up here. You do have the documentation on the learn.microsoft.com, but just know that there's a pretty extensive list of options there. So with that, let's switch to the next part in our deployment cycle, where I'm going to configure a new environment and then showing you some of the outcome of that. Cool. So from here, again, we're still in our AZD demo live example and already talked about some environments. Now what I can do is back in my terminal, I could now do AZD environment new, and it's going to ask me for a new name. So this could be the second PDT environment, and that's pretty much it. I could now do AZD environment list, and it's going to show me I got two of them. Which one is the default, which one is local remote, and so on and so on. For now, if I switch back to my Visual Studio Code, you can see that it now created a second environment. And here, this would allow me to now start creating different environment variables for my different Azure subscriptions, and so on and so on. And then I could do AZD environment set, and then it would ask me like, okay, which of those environments that I have would you like to move to the default? So quite, I would say pretty straightforward. Another example I have is where I actually deployed a live template. So I'm inside a series of examples here called AZD examples, all coming from a resource that I'll talk about a little bit later on. What I did is creating my environment. So inside, I'm going to use the correct one. Inside my AI Studio example, I have two environments, one PDT AI Studio, one for AI Foundry that I used earlier this week. And you can see that it's now creating a pretty long list of Azure variables. A lot of these are obviously resources that I deployed out of using this example. And if you're wondering where those actually come from, most of them are outputs from my traditional bicep templates. So inside my bicep, I create my output statements, and then based on that, they all get moved into the environment variables. So pretty powerful to again allow you to switch across Azure subscriptions to define locations for your deployments. And again, think a bit in a developer mindset. I'm going to run my app deployment across different scenarios, across different environments, where an environment could be dev and test staging, production, blue-green deployment, canary early adopter, across different Azure regions, and all that flexibility that comes with it. That's pretty much it on AZD environment, and let's switch back to the presentation for the next part. Sweet. So from here, it's ready to be deployed, I would say. So we're going to move to the next command, and that's AZD up. So AZD up is technically the command you would use to really deploy your end-to-end scenario. Now, why do I say end-to-end? Because in the end, AZD up is a combination of AZD package, which would compile the application source code on your local machine, and then running AZD provision, which would actually spin up the bicep or Terraform based deployment. But instead of running two other commands separately, you could now run AZD up, and it's going to perform them for you. Now, this gives actually quite some flexibility, because imagine as a developer, you start creating your app, but the infrastructure is not ready yet, or you don't need it to be deployed already. You could run AZD package or AZD up, but not having a template file. Or what if you already have the application, but throughout the week, throughout your sprints, your iterations, right, you would create different versions of your application. You could now also run the package as a compile validation. Now, also important here is that you need to have the framework, the SDKs, if you want, installed on your machine, which means if you want to run a Docker container package step, you need to run Docker on your machine. If you have a .NET application, you need the .NET SDK. If you have Java, you need to install Maven on your local machine. So that's really the prerequisite, I would say, before the package step or the combined up will actually work. So from here, another couple of demos where I'm going to walk you through a few sample templates that I already have and running our actual deployment end to end. Cool. So we're still in our sample initial minimal project, right? And what we have here is a little bit in the infra and no applications, but just showing you that you can run this even if you don't have an app. So what we need is AZD up, and that means provision, but we're not provisioning yet because there's no application. And it's going to ask for a subscription because it's not defined in my variables. So you could actually avoid a few steps by defining your environment variables. So it's picking up my subscription and it's asking for an Azure region. Now, since this is triggering bicep, you can imagine that if you have Azure policies running in the backend, if you got certain limitations where you could not deploy whatever you want to anywhere in Azure regions, then eventually the deployment will fail. AZD command line here will show you, will tell you, and then obviously it's up to you to fix it. But it's not an AZD problem. It's because the bicep infrastructure in the backend is blocking you from using it. So with this actually happening, if I switch to my Azure portal and I refresh, I go to resource groups, you can see that I do have my resource group available where now it picked up the second PDT because that's the new one I created and I didn't specify anything to switch back. Where now I could go in, move into deployments, and eventually your actual Azure resource deployment will show up here. The shortcut to do that is also listed up here, where during the deployment you could actually validate what's happening. To show you the outcome similar, but from a somewhat longer, I would say a little bit more complex deployment, is something like this one here. So what I did is the same step. I'm inside a scenario called Conference API. It deploys a web app, it deploys some other application components, and then it actually loops through all the Azure resources it needs to deploy. So it deploys the resource group, a log analytics, application insights, key vault, the dashboard, app service, and then API management. All that just out of the templates, where now if you're wondering what's behind it, we could again have a look in our template setup. So I got my .azure with my environment, already talked about this. I got my Conference API app, so basically just a C#.NET. In my infra, I have a few different templates. I got my main bicep, which deploys the resource group, and from there it's pointing to other resource bicep files. Following all, I would say, common guidelines on how to properly architect your bicep files and then running the deployment. And then last, so we did our deployment, everything was working fine, and now we don't longer need it, right? So instead of, although it's technically still possible, right, you would go into the Azure portal, you would delete it. Yes, I know you can delete it using Azure CLI, but why making it so complex? Why not using AZD down? And that's literally removing the application workload, which means it's going to delete the Azure resources from the Azure resource group, deleting the resource group itself, but also important is that the code or the artifacts on your local machine remain on your local machine. And then to maybe optimize the deletions a little bit, you could add the parameter purge, and that's going to allow you to actually force the deletion of like soft delete resources, like a Key Vault, Azure AI services would be good examples. And then even better, using the parameter force, and that's avoiding that confirmation pop-up like a confirmation request. And again, think about the fact that I mentioned you could move these into automation scripts, CI/CD pipelines, like the perfect automation engine. And with that, let's show you again how that command actually works in real life. Cool, so now we have our example up and running. We deployed resource groups, we deployed them in Azure, everything's running. And now for some reason, we no longer need it, right? So what we're gonna do is AZD down, where now it's triggering me to delete the resources. So important here, it's deleting the resource group, it's deleting the resources, and as I mentioned in the presentation, you can add the purge and the force parameter to not get those pop-ups to actually confirm something. From here, it's going to loop through, only takes a couple of seconds because there's not too much in this resource group, but you probably get the idea what's coming out of this. Cool. Now from here, you might go, okay, we started from basically nothing. We did AZD init. I picked that starter template and I got my artifacts. I ran my deployments. I cleaned it up. But you might still miss a little bit of that wow effect. So where it becomes really cool now is that you might have existing code, like application source code, right? You might have existing templates. And obviously, why not? You could actually have both. So what you can do now is playing a bit more with AZD init, and instead of starting from scratch, instead of picking a starter like the minimal project, you could now get access to an AZD product team catalog and actually downloading a starting point, and there's like 180 templates already available, which you can immediately reuse. You're gonna download them, you're gonna select them as part of your AZD init, and then just replacing the application code, maybe looping through the bicep templates or Terraform. But instead of you doing all the work, it's maybe just requiring 5, maybe 10% changes. So you could imagine I got another little demo for that. So for this next example, I'm going to take it a little bit different, where now the assumption is that I already have application code. So if you're a bit into, I didn't have to do that. If you're a bit into using Visual Studio, you're going to recognize this default source repos folder name location. Because what I have in here are a couple of Visual Studio Next.Finish.NET sample web applications. Where now I could go in any of these. So let's do the 020, and inside I got a Visual Studio solution. And if I move one level down, you can see that it's a traditional .NET, assuming that you're familiar with .NET. We're now inside my root folder. There's nothing besides my application. So what I can do here is go back to AZD init, and then instead of picking the minimal template or the minimal project, I could select to pick up the source from this folder. Now another example is actually leveraging templates. So what I can do is AZD init. We're now, instead of not using code, I'm going to go for select the template. So what's the idea here? Inside, it's going to pull up the list of sample code templates from the Azure AZD product team, and based on your scenario, and they got all these scenarios listed in the documentation. So I could, for example, here go for AZD Simple Fast API application on Azure App Service. So I'm going to use this one because it feels closest to the scenario that I need. Again, asking for an environment name. So this could be PDT Live 020. I'm going to use that one. And then once more, if we check in our Visual Studio code, you're going to see that a lot of it is already available. Now, one thing that changed compared to my previous demos is now this source folder. Inside the source folder, there's currently that sample app. In this case, it's Python, and that means it has the Python file and the requirements file. Now, I don't need those for my example, so I'm going to move them. And what I'm going to do here is bringing in my own live 020 inside the source folder, and then moving my solution pointer into the source. Whoops, I need to move that into my source folder. There we go. Now the part here is like, okay, how does AZD know where to find your application? Now remember, we used that Azure YAML file before, but there was not too much in there. Where now we can actually make some changes. So in this case, we want to update the name. So this could be the simple Live 0220 app. I could now update with my own template name. If I don't like this name, I could call it a simple Live 20 app. And again, this is just for sending some telemetry information to the AZD product team. There's a way to turn this off. I think if you don't have metadata template, it's not reporting anything. Infra is bicep, that's fine. And now I'm specifying what kind of service am I deploying. So what I need is, it's a web service, and my project is now the source, but it's inside Live 020. The language is no longer Python, but it's .NET, and the host is still an app service. Now imagine you want to publish your web app into a Docker container, into container apps. Then you need to check the docs and then updating host with container apps, for example. And that's pretty much it. Now from here you could assume like, okay, cool, we're basically done, but there is another little change we have to make, and that's inside our infra. Why? Because now obviously the infra folder is creating a web app for Python. Because remember, that's the starting point. We're now, and this is obviously assuming you know a bit about your ARM template syntax, but what this would need is .NET core, and then version 6. I guess that's fine. It's not really 6. I'm using .NET 9, but that's just the parameter syntax for an Azure App Service using the latest version of .NET. Then from here, so what we did again is starting from an existing application folder, we already have application code. And then instead of running AZD init with the minimal project, we picked a sample project, you could say, and then almost deleting all the stuff that we don't need, rewriting the templates. And in just a couple of minutes, I could now run AZD up, and that's gonna perfectly deploy everything for me. So I'm gonna do AZD up. It's gonna initialize, and then from here, it's becoming a little bit boring because we already walked you through all of this. It's gonna loop through, it's gonna deploy, so pretty straightforward. Awesome. Now, while there's more to AZD, if everything up till now at least, I would say makes sense, I hope everything is working as it should be. My demos work, so I hope it's the same on your end. And you're now in this step where, cool, I got it, Peter, thanks for the session, and I want to continue. Now, before finishing up here, let me talk for a few minutes about some other offering we have. Because remember, we have that capability to rely on already existing pre-built templates. Now, those templates are managed by the AZD product team. But the good news is here that out of, I would say, my own team, Microsoft technical trainers, together with Microsoft certified trainers like the non-Microsoft employee trainers, actually started working on a project about 3-4 months ago. And we decided to provide several of the demo scenarios that we use day in, day out for our own Azure classes and making them available as an open source platform. So you could basically do AZD init -t, so pointing to a template, and grabbing any of the template names that we have here in our catalog. Apart from the templates itself, we also provide cost and deployment time estimate, something that the AZD product team is not providing for now. And then since we're primarily focusing on training, we also provide a demo guide and some other Azure blueprints, like a documentation diagrams, you could say, what we cover in a specific training. And it's all part of the same deployed scenario. So also important is that we do love contributions. So if you got inspired by this session, you got templates, you got Bicep, you got Terraform, you got some sample apps, or overall you just want to contribute to the success of our project, I would say please don't hesitate reaching out and just start contributing. And you could guess there's almost the same comment that we would use, where now the main difference is it's no longer just AZD init, but we're going to point to AZD init -t and then picking up one of those templates. And again, obviously, our template list from the trainers are not the same ones than we have in the AZD product team, although there is some cross collaboration that some of our templates are actually showing up there. But then from here, it becomes quite easy. You run AZD init -t with the name of the scenario, like in my example here, PE Tender Conference API, which spins up a web API example that you could use in like a testing, minimal APIs, testing, REST API calls, and why not even integrating with API management in Azure, for example. Now, instead of talking about it, you could imagine I'm just going to show you how easy it is to actually get started. So with this last example, you can go to ak.ms, trainer demo deploy, and it's going to bring you to the home page of our trainer AZD templates. So from here you got a couple of different options. So what we have is allowing you to search for keywords based on the scenario topic. So API would give you some examples. You could filter based on community topics, based on Azure services, for which we do provide our examples. A little bit specific to training, but if you're into training as maybe a trainer or a cloud solution architect, or maybe you're a learner like one of our customers, and you're in an AZ204, you could basically map a lot of these scenarios with content from that training. Once you pick your scenario, it's going to open up a detail blade. And again, what we have here is the cost for running this, like typically in a trainer scenario. You would run this and then after a bit, you would delete it, like the end of the day, the end of the week. The cost in your Azure subscription. And then also important, if you have any specific application dependencies, it's also highlighted here. And if you follow the short links, it's going to bring you to the actual package installers. We got a demo guide. So again, typically for like a trainer where you deploy it and then you need to figure out what the scenario could look like. So that's what we have here. And then course blueprints is from another part of our trainer team, actually showing you full course architectures. Like these are all the building blocks we cover during a multi-day class. Now back to the deployments. In the end, we only need to run 4 steps to get this up and running. So what you can do here is create a new directory with some sample name, move into the directory, already showed you how to do this. And now the tricky piece is azd init pointing to the template and the name of the GitHub account and the GitHub repo. And then last azd up, as you can imagine, to deploy it. So from here, you could actually see where that information is coming from. We got the infra folder, we got some hooks, so running some template scripts before or after. And then in here, we got our Azure YAML file with all the steps that we need, all the parameters that we talked about. So if you want to spin up this example, it's basically azd init template, and this is going to create a function, it's going to create a web app, so it's going to create all the building blocks in the way you could expect it. So that's pretty much it, our trainer demo deploy.